Hi, Mr. McLeod here. This is Chapter 23B, the Cold War Era, Part 2. I'm not talking about the latter half of the Cold War, but really a different perspective of the Cold War era, 1945 to 1990. When I look at this time frame, I like to break it down into 4 time blocks that very conveniently look like this. They're overlapping times because these things are happening one on top of the other, not in succession. And the first is 40s and 50s, and that's just repair and rebuild. If you think back, 1929 was the beginning of the Great Depression, and then led much through the 30s, which was then followed by World War II. And so we've had 15 years of both economic and physical chaos, and most of the industrial world outside the United States has been severely hindered or even totally destroyed. And so it takes time just to rebuild that infrastructure and get that going. And we see that right now, even with our ability to get toilet paper, because anytime there's a disruption in the supply chain, it takes time to get equilibrium again. And so what we see throughout Europe and Japan and Russia and other places is just a significant repair and rebuild. And even in the United States and Canada, rebuilding not from physical damage from war, but just from 15 years of economic chaos and disruption. And this leads to the 50s and 60s, because once your life is settled and in order, you can start to look at other things. And so, for example, we see the Boeing 707, the first passenger jet. Boeing staked the company on this, and they said that we believe jet travel is the future, and that prop planes are not going to be what's going to get us into the next several decades. And it completely revolutionized global travel because for the first time, people could travel across the entire country or across the Atlantic without having to stop to refuel. And they could carry a lot more passengers on single flights as a result. And this completely changed things. And we're going to see results of that. From the 60s to 70s, we see a crisis of belief. And I don't mean just a spiritual belief, although I'll talk about that in a moment. It's really a kind of soul-searching time that people get through and saying, hey, are we making the right decisions and are we doing the right thing? Now, keep in mind that a lot of young people, high school and college-age people in the 60s and 70s were not born until after the war at this point, or they had been born early in the war and therefore had no memories of it personally, and they were not involved in any way. And so they didn't have the personal commitment to the country in terms of what was experienced in World War II. And that's really significant. And a lot of your parents were born during this time. Between 65 and 75 is when most of your parents, if not all of them, were born. And so the experiences of the 60s and 70s are the foundational imprints on their lives from growing up. And one of the things that we see here, for example, is the widespread use of television, which had just come out mostly in the early 60s in color television. And keep in mind that prior to 1990, anybody who wanted to watch TV could only watch 3 networks and a public television network, PBS. That's it. That's all they got to see. And if they wanted to watch a show, they had to watch it when it was broadcast, and that's it. So everybody in America, rich and poor, young and old, male or female, black or white, everybody watched the same shows. And so it created this kind of collective concept that we really don't see today when people can watch anything they want and Netflix can produce any kind of series of shows that you may have never heard of but your best friend loves. And so that was just not common in the 60s. The Vietnam War is just one example of course, the battle between communism and capitalism we talked about and you read in the book, so I won't go into any more of that. But we also see a religious revival happening as well, because anytime people's beliefs are put to the test, it's going to create a situation where people who truly believe in the Lord are going to strengthen those beliefs because they're now being tested. And then this leads into the 70s and 80s. And I call this the we're not alone era. And I'm not talking about outer space and people come from there. I'm talking about the shift from Western Europe being the kind of driving ideological force, which it had been for the previous 500 years. Because even the United States and Canada and other countries, they were primarily Western European in their thinking and heritage. And this has changed a lot in the 1970s. What we see here in the Pacific Rim, for example, is the rise of Asian cultures that you guys take for granted today, such as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. China, which of course is huge today, was not a player on the world stage at this time. And that's come very recently, since 1990. And so this is very significant, where these countries came really out of nothing and became global players in the business and economic marketplace. The other part of the world we see gaining influence during this time is the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and other countries in particular where oil was significant. Because prior to the discovery of oil, most of these places were just nomadic and not big players in the world stage, although significant in the Muslim community and thought, but otherwise not real big players in the world economy. But oil brought money in huge, huge ways. In fact, the largest company in the world today is not Apple or Microsoft. It's Aramco, the Saudi Arabian oil company, and it's at least double, if not triple, quadruple, or even 10 times bigger than the second largest company. And so all of a sudden, there's a lot of money in the Middle East and not a lot of places to spend it. And so what happens is they begin to become bigger players on the world stage. And when people become a bigger player on the stage, they want to have more say. They want to have more influence. And so in 1973, for example, the oil-producing countries decided that they wanted to have more say on the world stage. And so they created an oil embargo, which caused gas prices to double and triple almost overnight. Prior to that, gas had been very inexpensive. And so what we see here is that this oil crisis created a change in the economic stature of certain places. So for example, this is a 1976 Mercury Marquis made by Ford. My parents owned a car that looked just like this, except it was green. And this car got 9 miles to the gallon. And it had a huge gas tank, 25 or 30 gallons. And it didn't cost very much to fill it because gas was only 39 cents a gallon. But when gas tripled, and if your whole family's only making $10,000 a year and you've got 2 cars like this, and all of a sudden your cost of gas doubles and triples, that's going to have a huge impact on your ability to meet your family's bills. And also, gas was in short supply because the Arab nations were actually withholding fuel, and so it was just in short supply. So here's an example of the car we rented last month in Minnesota. This car gets 39 miles to the gallon, so more than 4 times the gas mileage of that other car. And so what you see here is a technological change because the crisis caused by the fuel embargo had led to technical innovations that resulted in, for example, greater improvements in gas mileage. And that's significant because that's really what happened in Japan and Korea and Taiwan and other places like those, because they have no natural resources, unlike the United States and Canada. Their ability to absorb these fuel crises was a lot less than it was in the United States, for example. And so because these countries were very energy dependent for their growing industries from the repair and rebuild time, the fuel embargo had a massive impact on their economies, and it forced them to find new ways to improve productivity and efficiency to reduce their dependency on oil. And as a result, these countries became among the most technologically advanced in our world. And so we've seen that shift where the Middle East and Asia are now major players in the world stage, along with North America and Europe and the communist world. And so it just greatly shifted the entire dynamic of our world and really opened the door for what we're going to see since 1990, in the 30 years since 1990. Thanks for listening.